Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Park Near North. For those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. Serve as one of the pastors here in the central region and at Park Near North, and it's a joy to be with you all. So I actually want to open up this morning by reading a prayer. It's a prayer that was written right around 100 years ago by a theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr, and it's often referred to as the Serenity Prayer. It reads like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. One of my brothers happens to be a massive fan of the Green Bay Packers, so much so that when the opportunity arose this past fall to buy into the franchise, he actually did, and now has a certificate on display in his home that proves he is part owner of the legendary and historic franchise itself, known as the Green Bay Packers. And as you may well know, they had a pretty incredible regular season, right? Where coming into the playoffs, they were a number one seed. They had a bye week, and my brother was so pumped. He was telling me beforehand, he's like, their season is going so well. Aaron Rodgers is on fire. They're never going to be healthier than when they start into the playoffs. I think they're going to take it home this year. They're going to win the Super Bowl, hands down. They've got it in the bag. And so he was pretty surprised when in the first game of the playoffs, they actually lost and were defeated by the San Francisco 49ers, unfortunately. And we got one there. We got one. Yeah. For anyone who's from Wisconsin, I'm sorry that this is what I chose to open with, but what happened was I gave him about a week to kind of process and mourn and work through everything he had to work through before we were talking, and I finally asked him, like, hey, what happened in that game, man? What happened to the Packers? And it wasn't a question that he particularly appreciated, but he responded by giving some really logical reasons that could actually be the real reasonable explanations for why the Packers lost that game. And then, as the conversation continued and we got a little further on down the line, he moved away from those logical, reasonable explanations, and he began to reveal the actual reason for why the Packers really lost their first game in the playoffs. As he kind of went on to confess to me that, through every single game of the regular season, I watched in the exact same location. And I don't even mean the same house. I don't even mean the same room. In the same exact chair every single game. Right? And not only that, he said, I enjoyed the exact same drink every single game, never changing, without fail. And yet, when it came to the very first game of the playoffs, not only did he go to the watch party and change the location, but he changed the drink that he chose to enjoy. And in doing so, he single-handedly undermined the rhythms that the entire success of the Green Bay Packers had been built upon the entire 2021-2022 season. And so, it took a lot for him to build that up. But anyways, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Right? Sometimes when it comes to sports and things like this, we kind of cast the illusion for ourselves just for fun that somehow with our own actions, we can actually affect the performance of the athletes and the teams that we love to watch. And more so, in that scenario, it's just kind of something that we do for fun. But I think the truth is, we actually do this. We kind of mix these categories up in our lives, not just for fun when we're watching sports, but I think we do this in a lot of other scenarios as well. Right, and just to share maybe a little bit of a heavier one, just for example, many of you know that about a year ago in our family, we had some pretty sudden unexpected health complications arise. Where, one morning I was finishing getting breakfast on the table, oatmeal with some brown sugar and frozen cherries and honey, a nice little spread. And then the next, I was going through the apartment and called to my wife to come to breakfast, didn't answer, and found her having what I can best kind of describe as sort of a stroke-like episode that in the end we found out was more so tied to her heart. And so immediately call 911. The paramedics arrive a few minutes later. They take her away to the nearest hospital. And from that point forward, the next 24 hours were just a complete train wreck of emotions as her condition continued to worsen and worsen into the evening, and then especially overnight, and still no diagnosis, to the point that when we talked over the phone about 24 hours into it, after a horrible night in the hospital that she had, we both kind of arrived at the place where we thought there was a pretty good probability that this would be our last conversation, and she probably wasn't coming home. Now, thankfully, as you well know, that's not how the story ended, and thank God she's still here today, and things are good. And I know that I've shared that story before with you all, but I just wanted to revisit it, mainly to pull another thread out of it that I think applies to what I'd really like to discuss this morning. And it's that in my own experience, prior to that event, I had kind of gone through life with this illusion that there was sort of a safety net around myself and the people that I loved the most. That maybe unfortunate and bad things happen to people out there, but when it comes to me and my family, there's kind of this safety net, and we're good, right? We're okay. And what this experience really revealed to me was that that's actually not the case, right? That there's actually not a guarantee that everything is going to be okay. And in the aftermath of this experience, especially the first several weeks, I found myself having almost a complete inability just to function in daily life, trying to go about work, answering emails and attending meetings. There was no chance at all that I was going to have enough focus to study and write a sermon. And part of that just, I think, had to do with sort of the healing process that takes place after an experience like that. But then there was also something going on where in my thinking, I found myself consistently so caught up, so consumed in how little control I had over the safety of the ones that I love the most, over how fragile this life really is. And again, I think part of that had to do with just the kind of being in the immediate aftermath of an experience like that. But at the same time, I think this is a tendency that we fall into even in just our regular daily lives, where our thoughts and our emotions get so wrapped up, so consumed in things that are completely beyond our ability to control. And that then has an impact that at times can be pretty devastating and damaging on the rest of our lives. And so it's in light of that tendency that I find the words of this prayer to be incredibly helpful. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. All right, and so as Lisa shared just a couple of minutes ago, we're actually continuing our series through the book of Daniel today, picking it up in chapter 1. And really the story that we see in Daniel is of Daniel himself, a young Hebrew boy at the beginning, and his 3 friends who get caught up in this exile where their nation is destroyed, their homes are burned, they're hauled off hundreds of miles away into a foreign nation, and we see them trying to find their footing and follow God faithfully in the midst of the chaos that is consistently surrounding them. And I think really the theme of control is an absolutely central theme to understanding not only the book of Daniel as a whole, but also the particular passage that we're looking into together this morning. And so to that end, as we're working through it, I really do just like to explore these questions together. All right, what is in your control and what is not? All right, what is in your control and what is not? And then the follow-up question would be, and what do you do about it? All right, and so if you have a Bible, or if you happen to bring one with you, would you go ahead and open up to the book of Daniel? We're going to be hanging out right there in kind of the latter 2/3 of chapter 1. And if you'd like a Bible, if you're down here in the stadium or kind of in the ground floor, you should be able to find one underneath the seat in front of you. If you're in the back, there should be one underneath the seat you're sitting in, but also we'll have the slides up on the screen, so you should be able to track along just fine. But if you'd like to see it on the page, Daniel chapter 1 is where we'll be. And to that end, we also have a table of contents. Just to keep me on the straight and narrow up here, we've got these 3 points: the situation, the test, and out of control. The situation, the test, and out of control. So that's where we're going this morning. All right, with that, let's jump into the first point now, the situation. And first thing we really need to do is backtrack a little bit to the earlier part of the chapter and just set the context so we understand what we're jumping into here. So let's pick this up together here in verse 3 of Daniel chapter 1. It says, then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, right? So the king of the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar, gives this command to one of his royal officials, the chief eunuch. And the command is what follows from here. This is what he says. Bring some of the people of Israel that we've just overthrown, that we've just defeated. Take some of them, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, right? Take people like this, young Hebrew boys who have the potential to serve as the king's advisors, and do this with them. Teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. That's the assignment. And for the duration of the period that this is meant to happen in, the king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king himself ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. And among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And so this is the situation that we see Daniel and his friends have found themselves in, right? They've been exiled, their homes destroyed, carried off into exile, put into a very vulnerable situation. And in the midst of that, they've been selected for this program where, in a sense, it's an opportunity, right? They have the chance at really making a life for themselves in exile here. However, it's anything but a guarantee because they have 3 years to study as much as they possibly can, to learn everything they can about the literature and the language of the Chaldeans so that at the end of it, when they stand before the king for their final examination, they can perform well and show that they are competent to serve as his advisors, in which case they will continue to be provided for the rest of their lives. However, if in this examination, when they are weighed and they are measured, if they are found to be wanting, right, the implication is that they will face a far more unfortunate fate altogether. So there's a lot riding on the line with this examination that's coming. And you can kind of sense how there would be a sense of dread and fear and anxiety looming over them, knowing that this examination is coming down the pike. And that's really the initial tension that we see setting up within the story. But then there's also an additional one that comes into it and complicates things just a little bit for Daniel and his 3 friends. If you notice in verse 5, it says that a portion of the king's, the meat that he ate and the wine that he drank was assigned to them. So throughout the 3 years, this is what they were meant to live on. And just to be clear, right, this is the king's food, this is the king's wine, so it is the best in all of the land. And just to bring this down to terms to us, I think this would be the equivalent of, just within my own dreams, this would be like having the opportunity to basically walk into Oshaval every single night, and you don't have to wait at all. Right? There's no 2-hour wait. There's no 3-hour wait. You just walk in and place the order. Maybe the order is already waiting for you. A burger with some bacon and some cheese just sitting on the table ready to go. That's what this is. Right? Or it's like having a reservation at Abba every single night. You don't have to book it 2 or 3 months out in advance. You just roll off the elevator and your table is waiting for you. So this is a pretty sweet deal. Right? This is pretty good, except for Daniel and his 3 Hebrew friends, right? The 4 of them being Hebrew, there is a complication here. And it's that they can't just eat the food. Right? Because what the passage goes on to say later is that if they were to eat the food, it would actually be defiling them, meaning with the relationship that they had been brought into with God as the people of Israel in the Old Testament, that there were certain foods that they were given to eat and certain foods that were not. And if they were to eat these foods, it would actually be damaging to their relationship with God. Right? It would be dishonoring to him. And that could be for one of a couple of different reasons. One may be that the food itself just wasn't kosher. And so they couldn't eat it because it violated the food laws in that way. Another instance may be that because they were in Babylon, that the meat and the wine may have been wrapped up in the worship of Babylonian gods before it reached their table. And so if they were to eat the food and drink the wine, they themselves would be participating and involving themselves in the worship of these other Babylonian gods. Right? And so it's one or the other, or some combination of the two. But either way, we know that if they eat this food and drink the wine, it will be damaging to their relationship with God. And yet they are not in any position to be making requests for special allowances. Right? Everything has just been taken from them. This kingdom has just showed them how little in control they are over everything that's happening to them. And yet now they're supposed to work up the courage to come forward and make a request to have a different diet assigned. And you can kind of see them trying to navigate between these two different tensions, right? Do we try to continue to pursue God in faithfulness, even in the midst of the vulnerability, of the risk, of everything that could go wrong here? Or do we just kind of give up, give in, eat the food, and do everything we can to make sure this examination at the end of these 3 years goes well? How do they navigate these two tensions that are coming at them in the very same time? To follow that thread, let's move into the second point now, the test. And let's pick this up in verse 8 together. This is what we see. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. So Daniel makes the decision. Right, that what happens with the outcome of this examination at the end of 3 years, he actually has no control over how things are going to go with that, but he can pursue faithfulness in this moment, and he resolves to do so with his diet. And so he goes to the chief of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, and requests, just explaining to him, hey, can we have some different food provided for us, some different food assigned to us, and explains his reasons for why. Right, and this is how the chief of the eunuchs responds in verse 9. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. All right, essentially, he's saying, I feel for you. I understand why this is important to you. I get why this matters. But at the end of the day, right, it won't just be your neck on the line. It'll be mine too. Because if I give you this special differing diet from what every other person in the program is eating, and if you somehow at the end of these 3 years look worse, or even if throughout it your health suffers and you're found to be in not as good of a healthy condition as everyone else, it won't just be your neck on the line. Right, but the king is going to know that this is because of the provision that I made for you. And so I'm sorry, I understand that this is not great for you, this is not comfortable for you, but I'm not putting my neck on the line just so you can avoid some foods that you happen to be uncomfortable with. Right? And at that point, you could almost understand how Daniel might just kind of give up and give in and fall in line. You could almost understand how he would give up the fight altogether. But what we see is Daniel knows he hasn't quite exhausted all of his appeals yet. And so he alters his pitch just slightly, and he goes to the one last place he has left to go to. In verse 11. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the steward being the person who actually handled the distribution of their food. So Daniel says this to him, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. All right, that's the pitch. All right, instead of asking for the full 3 years, he says, just give us 10 days. All right, just 10 days, just a week and a half. And then at the end of that, just take a look at how we look and look at how the rest of them look and see who looks better and deal with us according to that. Right? And whatever you decide will fall in line with that, because nobody's neck is on the line for just 10 days. That's the pitch. And this is how the steward responds. Verse 14. So he listened to them in this matter. He accepted and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. All right, which is why, as a church, on the brink of the Lenten season, we're actually about to do a church-wide Daniel fast, where we're going to clear out all of our meat, all of our wine, and eat only vegetables for the entire season of Lent. So you're hearing it first here. I'm just kidding. We're not doing that. You're welcome to. You're free to do that, but we're not going to do that together. Okay, so the point is, it works, right? They get the 10 days, and it works. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his friends look better in appearance compared to everyone else, and so they are able to have the diet that they want for the entirety of the 3 years, right? That they are able to pursue and live in faithfulness before God in this way. That resolves the first tension, right? And that's where they choose to focus their energies. Now, the broader question is, what's going to happen at the end of these 3 years? Right, we see how they've responded in the midst of this, but how is this final examination going to go? What is going to be the final outcome for them? And this is what we see, verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. So he gave that to all 4, and then what we see is he gives a little something extra to Daniel here. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. God blessed them in this way. And this is actually pretty important, especially the part about Daniel and dreams, for understanding the rest of the book of Daniel. So God gives that to them. And then this is what happens, verse 18. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before King Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king, meaning they went on to serve as his advisors. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. Side note, that note on King Cyrus at the very end basically means that Daniel served as an advisor to the king, not just for Nebuchadnezzar, but for 2 other kings as well, Cyrus being the last. And Daniel served in this capacity for a period of over 65 years, which just goes to show how valuable Daniel and his wisdom and his advice was seen to be. And so at the very end of this, we see that they stand before the king in this final examination, and they do well, right? They pass the test, and provision is made for them for their future. They avoid being discarded by the king. And this actually moves them into the position of serving as his advisors, which also is important for setting up the rest of the book of Daniel, as we'll see throughout the rest of it. One thing I do want to clarify here, though, is that I think it would be easy to read this in light of, they pursued faithfulness in their diet, so God blessed them in this way. So if we pursue faithfulness, God will bless us in the same way that we're looking for, right? That if we just read our Bibles and pray every single day, then we'll get the promotion we're wanting, we'll get into the school that we're looking for. And what I just want to be careful about is that I think you can't make that clear of a correlation. That's not the way that our relationship with God functions in the sense of a transaction. Because in no way in this story was God ever on the hook to provide for them because of their faithfulness. But it was purely his grace, his undeserved favor that he poured out upon them that enabled them to really do well in this examination. And the same is true in our own lives, right? That we haven't earned anything from God. But when he chooses to bestow good things upon us, to open doors for us, and to give us good things in our lives, it's not because we've earned it, but it's purely because of his graciousness, his goodness to us. And so we're intended to receive those things as a gift. So I just wanted to make a quick side note on that. But with that, let's pause the story of Daniel for today, move into our third and final point. I want to pull some things out of this story in particular before we move on that I think will be especially beneficial for us. So third point, out of control. Out of control. The story that I believe, the question in this story I believe is really inviting us to wrestle with is, what is in your control and what is not? What is in your control and what is not? The follow-up being then, what do you do about it? Because what we see in the story is that Daniel and his friends are in control of very little in this story. When it comes to what they're not in control of, that includes the fact that they were exiled, right? That everything is taken from them, that they're ripped away from their homes, that they're carried off to a foreign land. They have no control over that whatsoever. And even that they've been selected for this program to be trained for 3 years and then stand before the king. They have no control over that either. And really, they have no control over what the outcome of that examination is going to be. They can control the effort they put into it, how much they choose to study and how hard they work. But at the end of the day, what happens in the examination and afterwards is completely out of their hands. But we do see pieces to the story that are within their control, right? On the one hand, the determination that they put forward to study, but even more so, what the story actually highlights more than anything is the pursuit of their own faithfulness in the matter of their diet. Something that would have been very easy in light of all of the emotions that must have been swirling around them and in light of the chaos that they were experiencing. They could have very easily just kind of gave up and gave in, and yet they chose to pursue faithfulness, demonstrating courage in what was a very vulnerable situation. And I think in some ways they were able to do so because they took all these other pieces of their lives that were completely out of their ability to control, and they entrusted those things to God. And when they were entrusting those things to God, that freed them up to then pursue and focus on the things that had actually been given to them to do. And so the question is, what is in your control and what is not when it comes to our own lives? Because I think in our own lives, we have the tendency, rather than doing that, is actually to confuse these and to mix these up. What is in your control and what is not? And what happens so often is we mix up the categories and we end up giving so much of our time, so much of our energy and our attention to things that are completely beyond our ability to control. And that then leads us to neglect the things that we actually have been given to do. It leads us to neglect the things we actually can exercise some measure of control over. For example, going back to the story at the beginning, if I think about my own experience in the aftermath of what happened with our family, I can remember being so overwhelmed at how fragile the life of my wife and even our children felt. I remember sitting at times with my kids and even holding our youngest daughter, who was maybe 6, 7 months old at the time. And maybe there was like a hypersensitivity to it in the midst of that season, but I remember feeling their heartbeats and noticing it more and being overwhelmed by the sense of how fragile their lives really are, that there is no guarantee that their life will continue, that at any moment their heart could just stop beating and there's nothing that I can do about it. Right? I have no control whatsoever. And I can remember being so consumed by that thought. But then stepping back and looking at it, I was consumed by what I had no ability to control. And what that led me to do in the moment was to actually miss the things that I have been given to do, which is to love my children, which is to invest in them, which is to talk with them, play with them, to just enjoy them for the gifts that they are. See, I was so consumed by how fragile their lives actually are that it led me to actually neglect them. And that's why one of the things that the counselor that we met with said that was incredibly helpful to me was that God holds both our lives and our deaths in his hands. That God holds both our lives and our deaths in his hands, meaning, yeah, you don't have any control over this. There is nothing you can do to have any measure of control over this. And yet you can choose to entrust that to God, to trust that he is holding not just their lives, but also their deaths, which isn't necessarily a guarantee that their lives are going to go the way that you want them to, or that they'll go as long as you want them to. There's no promise there. But at the very least, you can trust the character and the goodness of the one who is holding them. And when that's the case, that frees you up to then step in and engage in the ways that you've been given to do. And so that's just kind of one way to tease it out. I think another one that is relevant for a lot of us just in the more day-to-day life is that we can get so wrapped up with what other people think about us and how they feel about us, where you go to a social event, right? Whether it was like a Super Bowl party, or you go to something, maybe even small group Bible study, and you have a good time while you're there and talking and interacting and laughing, and then as soon as you leave, you begin to replay the tapes of every interaction you had throughout the night, and you begin to rethink everything, to second guess the whole thing. To think, why didn't he say hi to me when I walked in? Why didn't she laugh at this joke? Did I offend them? Or did I offend this person? Do they think I'm stupid? Do they think I'm silly? We get so caught up thinking what other people think about us that it actually leads us to neglect the thing that Jesus has given us to do, which is to love them. Right? The two greatest commandments: love the Lord your God with everything that you have, and love your neighbor as yourself. But when we become so consumed thinking about what they think and what they feel, it leads us to neglect the thing we actually have been given to do, which is to love them. And if you think about it, if we can just take the things that are outside of our ability to control, if we can entrust those things to God and be freed up, right, to focus on the things that he has given us, that is such a much more beneficial way to go about our lives. And so again, I really think the question this story is leading us to wrestle with is, when it comes to your life, where are you giving so much time, so much attention, so much of your energy to something that is completely beyond your ability to control? And then what is that leading you to neglect? Right? And maybe you're here and you're saying to yourself, yeah, I understand this. I acknowledge that that's my reality. This is what I'm doing. But at the end of the day, I just don't know how to let go. Right? I wish I could. I wish I could just hand these things over, but I don't know how. Right? And as we get ready to close here, the thing that I would say is that the way you hand it over, it has to do with trusting the one that you're handing it over to. And what we see in the gospel is that Jesus himself was willing to give up everything to bring about our good. He was willing to give over even his own life to bring about our good. And if he was willing to commit that on our behalf, if he was willing to commit his own life to bring about our good, the one who has infinite resources, then why can't we trust him with everything? Why shouldn't he be able to handle everything that we can entrust into his hands? And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about following Jesus, is that we, just like anyone else, we don't know what tomorrow holds. We don't know what's coming around the corner for us. But at the very least, we know that we're entrusting ourselves to the one who does. We're entrusting ourselves to the only one who really knows what tomorrow holds. Which again, is not necessarily a guarantee that everything will go perfectly or in exactly the way that you want it to. But what we are promised in the gospel, right, is this: that whatever suffering or difficulty we go through in this life, none of it is in vain, because God will redeem all of it and will bring good things out of all of it. And at the same time, we know that none of it will go on forever. Right, that all of it has an expiration date, because the day will come when Jesus returns and sets all things right and makes all things new. And from that point forward, never again will the illusion of safety in this life be punctured or ripped away, because never again will it actually be an illusion. And to that we look forward. Would you bow your heads with me? I want to give you a moment just to reflect on your own life and to consider this question: that where in your life are you giving so much of yourself to something that is completely beyond your ability to control? Where in your life are you giving so much of yourself to something that is completely beyond your ability to control? And then what is that leading you to neglect? Yeah, Father, we thank you that you were willing to give up even that which was most precious to you, your Son, on our behalf, and that you have committed everything within your power and within your ability for our good. And so we can trust you with everything. And so we do ask, and I ask that as a church, as households, as families, as individuals, that you would enable us to take the things that are out of our control and give us the ability to trust you with those, to hand them over to you, and to then give ourselves to the other things in our lives that you have put within our ability to exercise some measure of control over. Would you give us the ability to trust you with it all? And now we close with this prayer. God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, and wisdom to know the difference. In Jesus' name, amen.